Let's break it down straight from the hill to your hometown. No spin, no hype, just facts we find. AI's on the case, no truth left behind. Laws are written, deals are made. Who's got your back, who's throwing shade? We cut through the noise, decode the text, keeping it real. Congress in context, Congress in context, shining the light, breaking it down so you know what's right. Policies, votes, who's working for you? We bring the facts, the power is you.
Welcome to Congress in Context, where we take a deep dive into the Congressional Record to help you understand what's happening on Capitol Hill. You sent us a ton of stuff, and today we're going to break down this recent edition. We'll cut through the noise and get to the heart of the debates, the votes, and those legislative trends that, really shape our government.
Yeah, it's like a cheat sheet to stay in the know. This Congressional Record gives us a peek into what Congress is actually doing, tackling all sorts of things from education funding to worries about what's going on overseas. We'll hit the main points of the arguments, see where folks agree and disagree, and try to figure out what it all means going forward.
All right, so let's just jump right in. And a good place to start is this big debate about education funding and what the Department of Education should even be doing. We have this representative from Oregon who's totally against any attempts to dismantle the whole Department of Education. And they specifically mentioned this Project 2025 playbook, which, if you're not familiar, is basically a whole policy agenda put together by some conservative groups.
The interesting thing here is that it reveals this really fundamental disagreement about what the federal government's role in education should even be. What this representative's worried about is that proposals, like the ones you find in Project 2025, could end up with less support from the feds for really important programs.
And that concern gets really specific when they talk about potential cuts to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, which makes sure students with disabilities get the services they need, and then also Title I funding. As a quick refresher, Title I is that flexible funding that goes to schools with a lot of low-income students to try to help close the achievement gap.
Exactly. And the representative was emphasizing that generally, what's needed is more funding, not less, to actually support students with disabilities properly. The worry is that cutting back on federal money for Title could directly impact the resources available to schools that serve, some of our most vulnerable populations.
And to show the human impact of all of this, the representative shared some really powerful stories from parents in Oregon. We heard from a mom who's worried about her 2 kids with special needs starting kindergarten if they cut IDEA funding. And then there's another mom whose kids depend on school breakfast and lunch programs that are funded through Title I. These stories bring it all home, from those policy debates to actual lives of everyday families.
It's so true. These personal stories really highlight a key part of the Congressional Record, right? It's that direct connection between what's being discussed in those legislative halls and the lives of the people those lawmakers represent. It's like a reminder that those debates about budget numbers, they actually have real consequences for real people and real communities.
Switching gears completely, the record also had some feel-good moments. We saw several members of Congress giving shout-outs to local sports teams for winning championships. We had the Albany Huskies for football, the Alexandria Cardinals for boys basketball, and the Fowler Eagles for girls basketball.
These might seem like small local things, but they actually give us a glimpse into that bigger role that members of Congress play as representatives of their districts. They're highlighting achievements that bring their communities together and that local pride. It's a different side of what they do, beyond all the lawmaking.
It is a nice break from some of the heavier stuff. And speaking of heavier stuff, a representative from Delaware brought up a very serious issue, food insecurity in their state. And it's affecting a lot of people, something like 1 in 8 residents.
Yeah, this really brings those challenges of poverty and access to basic needs to the forefront. The representative was specifically worried about possible cuts to federal support for the Food Bank of Delaware, which is responsible for providing over 600,000 meals. It just shows how much local organizations depend on federal programs to deal with these issues.
And it goes beyond just the food itself, doesn't it? The representative really emphasized that food banks offer dignity and hope and a sense of community. They're not just about handing out food, they're vital support systems.
That's so important. Food banks often connect people with other important services, creating a whole network of support. And if federal funding gets cut, it's going to put a lot of strain on state and local resources. And that could really affect how much help those organizations can give.
Now, for some good news coming out of Delaware, there was this talk about developing the Nylon Capital Center in Seaford. It sounds like a big local economic development project.
Yeah, it's a pretty big deal. They're trying to breathe new life into the area by making it a hub for education, healthcare, and business. It's a $60 million investment, and some of that's coming from the American Rescue Plan. The center's going to house a Deltec facility for job training, a Tidal Health medical site so people can get better access to healthcare, and they'll have space for small businesses and a co-working center.
And it sounds like they're making sure to keep some of the local flavor. They're going to keep Sal's Italian restaurant, which has been a community staple, as part of the new center. It's nice to see they're preserving that local identity, even with all this development going on.
Yeah, projects like this show how investments from different sources can come together to create local economic growth and really improve the quality of life for residents. They're getting access to education, healthcare, and all these new business opportunities.
Okay, let's move on to something that always gets people fired up. Social Security. We have this representative from New York who's strongly against anything they see as a threat to the program. They even called out President Trump and Elon Musk by name.
This representative is basically framing Social Security as a fundamental promise to Americans, those who've worked and paid into the system. They called it a vital safety net for seniors, widows, and folks with disabilities. And when you hear that over 167,000 people in their district alone rely on these benefits, it really hits home how important this is to so many people.
And they went head-to-head with Elon Musk, who called Social Security a Ponzi scheme. The representative said he might be mixing it up with those tax cut plans that mainly benefit the wealthy. It's a pretty direct clash of, economic philosophies.
It is. It goes straight to the heart of the whole debate about Social Security.
Yeah.
People have very different views on how it's structured and whether it's sustainable in the long run. This representative is clearly saying it's a benefit people have earned and a crucial part of our social fabric.
And we also heard from a representative from Connecticut who pointed out that Social Security benefits haven't really been increased in any big way since 1971. That gives you some important historical context. They also emphasized that it's the most effective anti-poverty program we have for both the elderly and children.
That historical perspective is really key. It reminds us that even though Social Security is this, bedrock program, it hasn't really adapted to how much society has changed over the past 50 years. And pointing out how well it fights poverty just reinforces how important it is as part of our social safety net.
All right, let's switch gears again and look at this debate about energy conservation standards, specifically for things like commercial refrigerators and freezers. Some folks argued that these regulations just end up costing more, limit consumer choice, and could even overload the power grid.
This is an argument that comes up all the time when we talk about government regulation. People say these kinds of standards can backfire and hurt the economy, plus they restrict options in the marketplace. And when they bring up the Congressional Review Act, which lets Congress overturn regulations made by the executive branch, it shows they might try to challenge these specific energy standards. Then there's the whole argument about natural gas being a cheap and reliable energy source, which is part of this bigger energy policy debate.
But someone else pushed back on this, calling the whole focus on commercial freezers frivolous. They said there are way bigger problems for their constituents, like this whole thing about maybe dismantling the Department of Education. It just shows that people have different priorities and different ideas about what's a big deal and what's not.
That's a good point. It suggests that this whole back and forth about commercial appliance standards might be taking attention away from bigger policy issues that could have a much bigger impact on people's lives. And when they suggested lumping all the appliance bills together and then moving on to things like healthcare and Medicaid, it shows they want to focus on what they see as the truly critical areas.
Now let's talk about a major piece of legislation they're considering. H.R. 1048, the DETERRENT Act, which stands for Defending Education Transparency and Ending Rogue Regimes Engaging in Nefarious Transactions Act. It's all about tackling foreign influence in higher education.
The main goal of the DETERRENT Act is to make things more transparent when it comes to foreign funding for colleges and universities. The worry is that these financial ties to foreign entities, especially ones considered unfriendly to the U.S., could pose a risk to national security if they're not out in the open.
And they brought up some specific examples, like the University of Delaware getting penalized for not disclosing that one of their faculty members was working at a Chinese university, while also getting a grant from NASA. And then there were these unreported contracts between U.S. universities, like UC Berkeley and Georgia Tech, and Chinese groups that might be involved with military stuff like hypersonic weapons research. These examples really show what kind of situations the Act is trying to prevent.
Those examples are definitely ammunition for the folks who support the Deterrent Act. They're saying the rules we have now aren't strong enough to stop foreign countries from taking advantage of American research and technology.
So what exactly is the Deterrent Act trying to change? It sounds like it's more than just making universities report more information.
It is. Some of the key things it would do is lower the bar for reporting foreign gifts. Universities would have to give a lot more detail about where the money's coming from, what it's for, and what the terms are. And if they don't follow the rules, the penalties are a lot stiffer, like big fines and maybe even losing federal funding altogether.
Yeah.
It's also trying to make the endowments of private universities more transparent, especially when it comes to investments in countries that are considered a concern.
This bill definitely sparked some debate, and there were several amendments proposed. One was trying to clear up the definition of foreign country of concern to specifically include those special administrative regions like Hong Kong and Macau. What was the thinking behind that?
They were basically trying to close a loophole. People in favor of the amendment were saying that, without making it crystal clear, groups that are controlled by or have close ties to countries of concern could just funnel money through these regions to fly under the radar.
And there was another proposed amendment that wanted to make the definition of foreign entity of concern the same as it is in those existing regulations about research and development. Why was that considered important?
It was all about making things consistent across the board when it comes to dealing with foreign influence. If all these definitions match up, it's easier for universities to understand what they need to do, and it makes sure everyone's on the same page when it comes to national security concerns in research.
But the Deterrent Act had its fair share of critics, too. Some people were worried about what it could do to international research collaborations and academic freedom. Groups like the American Council on Education and the Association of American Universities expressed some serious reservations. What were their main concerns?
They were mainly worried that the act was going too far and would create a huge administrative headache. They thought requiring disclosure of every little gift, even something small and personal, from any foreign source would be a pain and might discourage valuable academic exchanges between countries. They were also concerned that the rules for getting waivers for certain contracts could actually get in the way of important research partnerships. They basically wanted a more collaborative approach to figuring out these regulations.
We also heard arguments that this bill could unintentionally backfire, like creating a hostile environment for international researchers, and maybe even fueling xenophobia, especially towards Asian American scientists.
Those are some serious ethical concerns. These critics are saying the act is so broad that it can make people suspicious of each other and stifle academic inquiry. Plus, it could discourage international collaboration, which is often really crucial for scientific progress.
It's interesting. There was this amendment proposed to include countries with officials who have outstanding arrest warrants from the International Criminal Court on the list of foreign countries of concern. That sparked a whole other debate, especially when it came to Israel.
That amendment brought in a whole layer of complex foreign policy issues. It connected these concerns about foreign influence in education to international legal battles. The debate showed how people have different views on whether the ICC is legitimate and how it's handled situations with specific countries. It's an example of how all these different policy areas can be intertwined.
Moving on from this whole foreign influence debate, the House also passed H.R. 1534, which is all about making American industries more competitive by focusing on research and development and how we make cement, concrete, and asphalt. This seems like something that had more widespread support.
Yeah, bills like this usually get more bipartisan support because they directly address things like economic growth and improving infrastructure, which tend to be areas where both sides of the aisle can find common ground.
And then we have House Resolution 242, which is basically about setting the rules for debating the energy conservation standards and the Deterrent Act. It's like a procedural thing they have to do to move these bills forward. And then there's H.R. 433, which is trying to stop them from reorganizing the Department of Education. That takes us back to where we started our conversation.
These procedural moves are important if you really want to understand how the sausage gets made, so to speak. HRES 242 tells us how they're going to actually have those debates on the big issues, while HR 433 shows us that the fight over what the Department of Education should look like and what it should be doing is far from over.
Over in the Senate, there were some important things happening, too. Gianta Patargia was confirmed as the new director of the National Institutes of Health. They had to invoke cloture to get there. In case you don't know, cloture is a procedural vote to shut down debate and get to a vote on the nomination. It's a big deal because the NIH is a key player in medical research.
Getting a new NIH director confirmed is super important because it means this vital agency, which is responsible for so much medical research and public health work, has stable leadership. And using cloture tells us that enough people supported the nomination to prevent any delays or drawn-out debates.
And along the same lines, the Senate also invoked cloture on James Bishop's nomination to be the Deputy Director of the Office of Management and Budget, another really important role in the executive branch because they oversee government spending. We talked about some of the concerns surrounding this nomination earlier.
Yeah, there were definitely some questions about Mr. Bishop's past views on the federal workforce and spending policies. But invoking cloture meant the Senate could go ahead and vote on whether to confirm him.
Switching gears again, Senate Resolution 138, which is basically a statement of support for Deep Vein Thrombosis and Pulmonary Embolism Awareness Month, was passed. Resolutions like this can help raise awareness about important health issues.
It's true. Congressional resolutions can be a powerful tool for bringing attention to different causes and encouraging the public to learn more and take action.
There were also tributes to former Congresswoman Mia Love, Congressman Raul Grijalva, and others who have served their communities. It's a good reminder that there are real people behind all these policy decisions.
Those moments are like a tradition in the Congressional Record. It's their way of acknowledging and honoring the people who have dedicated their lives to public service.
And we saw a bunch of shout-outs to different people and businesses, from a super-achieving cadet to local businesses celebrating milestones. It shows how members of Congress connect with the people they represent in all sorts of ways.
Those recognitions are a nice way to highlight the accomplishments and contributions of people and organizations all over the country. They reflect all the different things going on and what people care about in different states and districts.
The Senate also introduced the Unity Through Service Act, which is all about encouraging people to serve in the military, do national service, or to serve their communities in other ways. It seems like they're really trying to promote civic engagement across the board.
This proposed legislation shows that there's interest on both sides of the aisle in cultivating a culture of service and encouraging folks to get involved and contribute to their communities and the nation in different ways.
And last but not least, they mention receiving a message from President Trump about the national emergency in Venezuela and the additional steps he's taking. It shows that the executive branch is still very much focused on foreign policy.
This tells us that the executive branch is continuing to deal with the situation in Venezuela and using the president's powers to address what they consider a national emergency.
This brings us to a broader conversation about the political climate we're in and the issue of economic inequality. A senator from Pennsylvania used their special order hour, which is basically a time when a senator can speak their mind on whatever topic they choose, to talk about economic populism and patriotism. They made the case for focusing more on the needs of working people.
This reflects a growing feeling, especially among certain political groups, that we need to address the gap between the rich and the poor and really fight for the interests of working-class Americans. And framing it as economic populism and patriotism is a way to connect economic policies with national identity and the well-being of all Americans.
During this discussion, they shared some really troubling stories about families struggling to keep up with the rising cost of living, especially food prices. They even said that egg prices are expected to go up something like 41%. Plus, there are worries about what could happen if they cut programs that help people afford food. These stories really paint a picture of the economic pressure so many Americans are facing.
It's true. Those stories and those economic projections really show how economic trends and policy choices directly impact the lives of everyday people and families, especially those who are already struggling to make ends meet.
There were also concerns about big corporations getting even bigger in industries like grocery stores and healthcare. Some people argue that this leads to higher prices and lower quality. And then there's the whole problem of the crazy housing market and how private equity firms are driving up rents. All of this is contributing to a lot of economic anxiety.
No doubt. When a few companies control everything in a market, it can stifle competition and make things more expensive for consumers. And the housing market is creating huge affordability problems in lots of places.
The senator also brought up the stark reality of income and wealth inequality in the U.S. They said a tiny group of people own more wealth than the entire bottom half of the population. That's a pretty mind-blowing statistic that shows just how concentrated wealth has become.
It's a really powerful image that shows just how unequal the distribution of wealth is in this country. And it's a key talking point for people who are pushing for policies to reduce that inequality.
And they also connected economic hardship to shorter lifespans for working class people. That's a really concerning sign that economic inequality affects our society in profound ways.
Absolutely. It highlights the fact that economic disparities have huge social and health consequences. It's not just about money. It affects people's overall well-being.
The discussion also turned to the high cost of prescription drugs in the U.S., especially compared to other developed countries. They pointed to the influence of the pharmaceutical industry and the fact that the government doesn't negotiate drug prices, which has been a hot-button issue for a long time.
It's definitely a major sticking point in healthcare policy. There's this ongoing debate about whether the government should step in and try to lower drug prices.
Finally, they brought up the idea of an oligarchy and this worry that super wealthy individuals might care more about getting even richer than about protecting social programs. It reflects a pretty critical view of how things are right now in our economy and our politics.
That viewpoint suggests there's this concern that the concentration of wealth and power is leading to policies that benefit the few at the expense of the many, and that social safety net programs could be on the chopping block.
This naturally leads to a discussion about the fiscal challenges facing our nation. One representative pointed out that the U.S. is on an unsustainable path where we're projected to spend way more than we take in. That kind of imbalance can have serious consequences down the road.
This is that constant struggle to find the right balance between what the government spends and what it collects in revenue. If that gap keeps growing, it could lead to even more national debt and put our economy at risk in the future.
They also emphasized that Medicare and Social Security are facing huge financial challenges in the long run, which brings us back to our earlier conversation about what the future holds for these essential programs.
These entitlement programs are facing some serious long-term financial pressures because of changing demographics and rising healthcare costs. We need to keep paying attention to these issues and be open to potential reforms.
They talked about how things like people retiring earlier and the possibility of the working age population shrinking if we don't have more immigration could put a strain on both Social Security and the labor force. These are important trends to keep in mind when we think about the future.
Absolutely. Those demographic trends are going to play a huge role in shaping our economy and determining whether social insurance programs can survive in the long run.
We also heard examples of government waste and fraud, like pandemic loans going to people who are already dead and problems getting broadband internet set up even though they've spent tons of money on it. This stuff raises questions about whether the government is spending taxpayer money wisely.
Those examples show how important it is to have strong oversight and make sure the government is accountable for how it spends money. They need to make sure those funds are being used properly and actually achieving what they're supposed to.
Someone suggested using data-driven solutions and technology to get better at fighting waste and fraud. That sounds like a promising way to make the government more efficient.
It makes sense. If they use technology and data analysis the right way, it could be a powerful tool for holding the government accountable and making sure public funds aren't being misused.
Finally, they talked about the idea of changing incentives in healthcare, especially for managing chronic illnesses like diabetes. They said this could help lower costs and improve health outcomes at the same time. It sounds like a proactive approach to healthcare.
It's a strategy that focuses on preventing illness and managing chronic conditions effectively. The goal is to help people stay healthier while also addressing the rising costs of healthcare.
Now, there were also some concerns raised about things the executive branch has done, specifically some of President Trump's past comments about the First Amendment and the media. This goes to the heart of how our democracy works.
Protecting free speech and a free press is absolutely essential for a healthy democracy. It allows for open debate and makes sure those in power are held accountable.
They said that President Trump blocking funds that Congress had already approved could be illegal. This highlights the separation of powers between the different branches of government and how important it is to respect Congress's power over spending.
The power of the purse belongs to Congress, and the executive branch is supposed to carry out the laws that Congress passes, including how money is allocated.
They mentioned that Project 2025 playbook, again, this time as a potential threat to Social Security. It seems like people are really paying attention to this broad policy agenda.
The fact that they keep bringing up Project 2025 shows that it's a significant policy blueprint that could have a major impact on all sorts of things if it's put into action.
There were also concerns about reports that the Secretary of Defense might have used insecure messaging apps to talk about sensitive military stuff. That raises serious national security risks.
Keeping communications secure especially at the highest levels of government, is absolutely crucial for protecting sensitive information and national security interests.
James Bishop's nomination for deputy director of OMB also faced some pushback. People were worried about his past support for shrinking the federal workforce and his alignment with an administration that some people see as not caring much about spending laws. It just goes to show that there are very different philosophies about how big the government should be and how we should manage our finances.
The opposition to his nomination shows that people are worried about the impact he might have on federal employees and how he might handle government spending and congressional appropriations.
On a more positive note, they did acknowledge that President Trump took action against Houthi militants in response to Iranian-backed violence. It shows that there are some areas in foreign policy where there's more agreement across party lines.
Even though there's a lot of political division, it seems like there's some recognition of executive actions that are taken to address threats to national security.
Now, let's talk about the judicial branch. People brought up concerns about attacks on the federal judiciary, saying it could damage the rule of law and the constitutional order in the long run. Having an independent judiciary is one of the cornerstones of our system.
It's true. The independence of the judicial branch is essential for our system of checks and balances. It ensures that the law is applied fairly and impartially to everyone.
They stressed how important it is to respect court decisions and use the appeals process instead of attacking judges for political reasons. It's about using the proper channels to address disagreements about the law.
It's crucial to use the established legal processes for reviewing and potentially overturning court decisions. That's how we maintain the integrity and stability of our judicial system.
They also pointed out that appellate courts can play a role in preventing the executive branch from overstepping its bounds. It's a great example of our system of checks and balances in action.
It shows how the judiciary can act as a safeguard against any branch of government getting too powerful and make sure everyone follows the Constitution and the law.
And they made it very clear that the president is not above the law and has to follow court orders just like everyone else. That's a fundamental principle of the rule of law in a democracy.
The idea that everyone is equal under the law is essential for a just and fair society.
There was also a brief mention of trade and tariffs, with President Trump expressing concerns about trade imbalances with Canada and the Canadian Prime Minister responding to potential U.S. tariff increases. It highlights how complex and sensitive international trade relations can be.
Trade relationships and tariff policies have a huge impact on everyone involved, and they often involve ongoing negotiations and political considerations.
There was also discussion about the origins of coronavirus research, specifically about the U.S. funding research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology through Dr. Peter Daszak's EcoHealth Alliance. This has been a hot topic and a source of a lot of debate.
The focus was on what this research was about, which was trying to understand if bat coronaviruses could jump to humans. And they acknowledged that there are still a lot of unanswered questions about how the COVID-19 pandemic started.
Finally, they took a moment to remember the one-year anniversary of the Francis Scott Key Bridge collapse in Baltimore. It was a terrible tragedy, and they talked about how quickly people responded and the ongoing efforts to rebuild. It's a reminder of how devastating infrastructure failures can be and how important it is for communities to be resilient.
It was a time to remember those who were lost and recognize the hard work that went into recovering and rebuilding after such a terrible event.
So as you can see, this recent edition of the Congressional Record gives us a broad look at the wide range of issues that are being considered and debated in Washington. It shows just how complicated governing is in today's world.
What's really striking is how all these different topics, from local sports teams to national security, are all part of what our elected officials have to deal with. It shows the wide range of responsibilities they have.
What stood out to you from this deep dive? Are you more concerned about potential changes to education policy, the growing focus on foreign influence in our universities, or the debates about Social Security and our nation's finances? These are all big issues with big implications.
This look at the Congressional Record really highlights how important it is to stay informed about the decisions being made at the highest levels of government and to understand the different perspectives that shape those decisions.
We hope this breakdown has helped you get a better grasp on some of the key debates and legislative actions that are happening right now. We hope you're feeling more informed and more engaged with how our government works. This is just a snapshot, of course, but it gives you some valuable context.
If you're interested in learning more, you can always check out the Congressional Record yourself. It's a public document, and it can be really eye-opening to read about specific bills or debates that caught your attention.
Here's something to think about. The congressional record might be long and sometimes hard to follow, but it gives us a direct look into what our elected representatives care about and what they're focusing on. How can we use this resource, along with other reliable sources of information, to stay informed, get involved in our communities, and hold our representatives accountable for the choices they make? It's an important question to ask ourselves as we try to navigate the complexities of our democracy.